For nearly 2 years, Australia had managed a careful balancing act. The Australian government supported Malaysia politically, believing the new federation contributed to regional stability. Yet Australia had avoided direct involvement in the confrontation with Indonesia. The fighting had remained confined to the remote jungles of Borneo. British, Gurkha and Malaysian troops carried the burden of the campaign, continuing to contain Indonesian incursions. If confrontation was going to succeed, President Sukarno and his advisors needed a new approach. The result would fundamentally alter the course of the conflict and would force Australian ministers to confront a question they had been facing since confrontation began. Would Australia fight? By mid-1964, Indonesian leaders had become increasingly frustrated. Nearly 2 years of confrontation had achieved remarkably little. The creation of Malaysia had gone ahead, the new federation had survived, and British military power in the region remained largely intact. The first major operation occurred on 17th of August 1964, Indonesia's Independence Day. In the early hours of the morning, approximately 100 Indonesian infiltrators landed near Pontian on the southwest coast of Johor. The force consisted of Indonesian army personnel and volunteers who had crossed the Strait of Malacca by boat. Now, Indonesian forces were expanding the confrontation onto the Malayan mainland. Indonesian planners expected the operation to produce political as well as military results. They believed sections of the local Malay population would support the infiltrators, encourage wider unrest, and undermine confidence in the Malaysian government. However, local villagers reported the landings almost immediately. Police, military units, and Home Guard personnel rapidly moved into the area. The infiltrators found themselves isolated. Over the following weeks, they were hunted down, captured, or forced to surrender. The operation collapsed, yet Jakarta remained determined to escalate. On 2nd September 1964, Indonesian Air Force transport aircraft crossed the Malacca Straits and dropped 96 paratroopers near Labas in Johor. The operation was intended to demonstrate that Indonesia could strike deep into Malaysia. Instead, it became another failure. The paratroopers were scattered across a wide area, landing far from their intended objectives. As at Pontian, local civilians quickly reported their presence. Police and military forces launched extensive search operations. One of the most notable clashes occurred when New Zealand troops engaged Indonesian paratroopers near Labas, killing several of them. Within days, the operation had effectively collapsed. Most of the infiltrators were captured, killed, or surrendered. Militarily, both operations failed. Politically, however, they represented a significant turning point. Even with this escalation, Australia avoided direct military involvement in the confrontation. Australian policymakers still hoped that relations with Jakarta would eventually improve, and they were still greatly concerned that military engagement risked damaging Australia's long-term relationship with the largest state in Southeast Asia. In the early hours of 29 October 1964, Indonesian forces launched another infiltration operation against mainland Malaysia. This time the landing occurred near the mouth of the Sungai Kesang River southeast of Malacca. The force consisted of Indonesian military personnel, volunteers and local collaborators transported across the Strait of Malacca by fishing boats. Reports suggested that as many as 100 infiltrators had reached the coast. Security authorities reacted quickly. Brigadier McMeekin, commander of the 28th Commonwealth Brigade, concluded that additional troops would be required. Among the forces available was Australia's 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. McMeekin then sought clarification regarding whether Australian soldiers could participate. The Australian High Commissioner Tom Critchley became involved in the discussions and undertook to inform Prime Minister Robert Menzies directly. Approval was granted for Australian troops to be used in a supporting role. D Company 3 RAR was deployed as part of the operation. Australian soldiers assisted in establishing blocking positions, conducting sweeps through the surrounding countryside, and preventing the infiltrators from escaping. As the cordon tightened, Indonesian personnel found themselves increasingly isolated. Many surrendered. Others were captured while attempting to evade patrols. Would Australia's involvement go any further? Throughout late 1964 and early 1965, Indonesian forces continued their effort to infiltrate the Malayan mainland and Singapore, launching 39 separate infiltration attempts against Malaya and Singapore. In total, more than 700 Indonesian personnel took part in these operations. Hundreds were killed, captured or surrendered. The local population consistently failed to provide the support Indonesian planners had anticipated. In October 1964, the Australian Defence Committee completed an assessment of the confrontation. The committee's position was that Indonesia was attempting to establish a position of predominance in Southeast Asia. Malaysia happened to be the immediate target, but the implications extended much further. If Indonesia succeeded in destabilizing Malaysia, confidence in British and Commonwealth security guarantees could be weakened. Regional governments might begin questioning whether Britain and its allies were willing or able to defend their interests. The credibility of the entire regional security structure could be damaged. At precisely the moment the confrontation was escalating, another crisis was demanding increasing attention: Vietnam. Throughout 1964, the situation in South Vietnam continued to deteriorate. American involvement expanded rapidly. Pressure grew for Allied support. Australian ministers therefore found themselves confronting two major security challenges at the same time. Both conflicts involved the future political direction of Southeast Asia. Yet Vietnam complicated every discussion about Malaysia. Australia's military resources were limited. Every battalion committed to Malaysia was unavailable elsewhere. This encouraged caution. Australian ministers did not wish to become heavily involved in two expanding conflicts simultaneously. However, at the same time, Vietnam also strengthened the argument for supporting Malaysia. Some policymakers feared that failing to support Malaysia while backing the United States in Vietnam would send contradictory signals to allies throughout the region. Vietnam therefore created a strategic dilemma. It made intervention more difficult, but also made disengagement less attractive. Throughout late 1964, British officials repeatedly pressed Australia for a larger contribution. From the British perspective, Australia was benefiting from the defence of Malaysia without making a comparable contribution. Also, the New Zealand government had already agreed that its battalion could be employed against Indonesian forces. The Australian government still said no, having grown increasingly less influenced by British considerations since the end of World War II. Reports from Borneo suggested Indonesian activity was increasing rather than declining, with continued attempts at infiltration against the Malayan mainland. British commanders warned that additional troops would eventually be required if the confrontation continued to escalate. Given the ongoing nature of the escalation, by late January a new consensus emerged within the Australian government. If Australia wished to support Malaysia and maintain confidence in the regional security structure, some form of military commitment would be required. On 27th of January 1965, the Australian government made its decision. The 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, would be committed for service in Borneo. An Australian Special Air Service squadron would also be made available. The choice of 3 RAR was logical. The battalion was already stationed in Malaysia as part of the Commonwealth Strategic Reserve. It was trained, available and familiar with conditions in the region. For the soldiers of 3 RAR, the decision marked a fundamental change. They had arrived in Malaysia expecting a period of training and regional security duties. Instead, they were now preparing for active operations against Indonesian forces. In March 1965, 3 RAR began moving to Sarawak. So it came to be that Australia would fight. Once Australian troops entered the jungles of Borneo, how far was Australia prepared to go? What would be the extent of the commitment? That question would define the next phase of the confrontation, and it would take Australian soldiers into one of the least remembered wars in the nation's history.